Welcome, and thanks for joining us for another ITPro live session. My name's Adam Shepherd, Reviews and Community Editor for ITPro. In this session, we're going to be talking about building a cloud minimum viable product. We've already heard today about running applications in the cloud, and we've heard about using cloud services to keep in touch with customers. But what about actually building the applications that those customers and even internal staff at your own companies are using on a day-to-day basis? What are the challenges involved with getting those applications up and running quickly? Those are the questions we're going to be exploring in this session. And to answer them, I'm joined by a number of insightful panelists. I'm joined by Alex Hilton, Chairman of the Cloud Industry Forum, Lee James, EMEA CTO of Rackspace Technology, Marc Pell, CTO of TempCover, and Matthew Leighton from Salesforce. So to kick us off with, I'll go around the group, and if you could just give us a little bit of an introduction to yourselves, your companies, and your own personal specializations when it comes to cloud and cloud applications. Alex, if you could kick us off.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. And thank you for the invite. Delighted to attend. So as you can see, my name is Alex Hilton, and I am the Chief Exec, actually, of the Cloud Industry Forum. We're an IT trade body, a not-for-profit organization. We've been in existence for the last 10 years. And our role or remit essentially is acting on behalf of the industry or anybody reselling and building cloud services. So that might not even be resellers, might be end users themselves. We conduct research, we do a lot of speaking engagements, and things of that nature, really trying to help people understand with the challenges and the opportunities indeed that exist for cloud, and there's so many variations and derivatives thereof these days. So delighted to be able to participate and talk with you today.
Thank you very much, Alex. Lee, what about yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody. Alex, thanks for having me here today. I'm Lee James. I'm the EMEA CTO for Rackspace Technology. Hopefully many of you know who Rackspace Technology are. We're one of the leading multi-cloud services companies globally. We're about 6,500 employees today with 125,000 customers that take private, public, multi-cloud solutions from us, both in the professional services and the managed services capacity. And one of the leading VMware, Microsoft, Google, and AWS partners globally too. I specialize in organizational transformation, as well as Devops or DevSecOps, or what everybody wants to call it this week or this month. But then also CI/CD pipelines and building applications in the cloud too. So thanks for having me today.
Thanks very much for joining us. Marc, what about you?
Hi Adam, thanks for having me. So I'm Marc Pell, CTO at TempCover. TempCover are a short-term motor insurer, so we cover cars, vans and bikes for as little as 1 hour and up to 28 days. We are quite a, I wouldn't say niche, but not a normal insurer in the sense that most people are used to insuring their car for a year, obviously. And therefore finding that customers, especially at the moment, are looking for flexible ways to borrow cars, maybe not get on public transport at the moment, for example. So we offer a solution to that. Our platform is in the cloud. It's up in Microsoft Azure, utilizing many different parts of that. My background is in software engineering. So I started at TempCover, rebuilding the platform, as we spoke about on the podcast a couple of months ago. And yeah, that's us.
Thank you very much. And Matthew, for any viewers who may not have seen your Q&A session with Carly Page, which you joined us for just mere minutes ago, could you give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and your specializations, please?
Sure, and thanks for having me again, Adam. Thank you. So I work for a company called Salesforce, and generally in the technology space, we're pretty well known for being born on the cloud CRM solution. But more latterly, there's a lot more to Salesforce than just that. We've been very highly acquisitive in a multitude of areas that have enabled us to build out industry-led solutions and integration platforms all on the cloud. So my role in that, I'm a platform lead in CPG or consumer goods and manufacturing, What that actually means is I get involved in the app dev stuff that gets done on the platform itself. So all the low code through to what we call pro code, so programmatical stuff. So this is very much at the heart of what I'm interested in and how we build out solutions for clients.
Thank you very much. So let's dive straight into the meat of this subject then. What does a minimum viable product look like from your perspective? You know, we often hear the phrase minimum viable products tossed around, particularly when it comes to startups or when it comes to getting entirely new products and technologies off the drawing board and into the market, if you like. But what does that actually mean from a practical standpoint? Lee, I know you've been involved through Rackspace in a number of different projects in the cloud. What does a cloud minimum viable product look like to you?
Oh, great question. I think what it's not meant to be is fully productionized, ready to roll, and never to be touched ever again. I think we, in my history, both at Rackspace, in my previous history as well, at Betfair, the gambling company, and BP, these the term was very buzzwordy. You know, get a minimum viable product out there. Let's fire it up as quick as we can. And then actually what generally tends to happen is it becomes production before you know it. So I think for me, I always like to look at a minimum viable product I always call it the 10%er. You know, it's that product that is, it's intended to test out the theory, test out the premise, most importantly, the value proposition, also then the impact of how to deliver on that value proposition from across different parts of your company. And then finally, just how's it going to excite, whether it's your customer, whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, how will it excite somebody? So yeah, I call it the 10%, and I think that's stood me in very good stead when I've worked with customers, and the term generally tends to pop up. Let's get something out there really quickly, but let's make sure that actually at 10% we do stop, come back in, and re-review again.
And Alex, I would imagine through Cloud Industry Forum, you've been party to a lot of these kind of conversations with the companies that make up the organization's membership. What does it mean to you, this term?
Yeah, well, I'll be honest with you. Let me start with this. I actually don't like the term very much. I think it has many negative connotations. It implies, taking on Lee's point there, something that's half-cocked, unfinished, not ready, shouldn't be released to market. I've spent 30 odd years, despite my youthful looks, working in the software industry. Thanks, Adam. And I worked in Borland. Many of you remember them. Software business. I worked for Microsoft for half of my career, and I then left there and joined smaller software businesses in the bid to make my fortune. And here I am today. The point around that, though, really is that with the career in software businesses, I've seen many minimal viable products, and to exactly Lee's point, these have been products that have been launched to market and commercially aimed at the masses, and due to commercial pressures within the business, I'm talking on the vendor side of things here rather than an internal usage technology, due to commercial pressures within a business, it's got to be a minimal viable product. What can we get? Because we've got a commit date of launching this stuff. Now, what I will say, the other side of this coin is the world that we now live in is so much better in terms of the concept of a minimal viable product, because we have this wonderful thing that we call cloud, which you would perhaps expect me to say, Adam. But what that does enable is scale. It enables you to release things that you can then do updates. You know, the day of queuing for your Windows 95 product in your PC World Store are long gone, thank goodness. The updates come down at a steady and very frequent pace. So that, to me, is where this MVP concept can now work, having many years ago dealt with MVPs that actually were commercially often inept, in my view.
And I think there's a couple of very interesting points in there that I'd like to circle back to later on in this discussion. But for now, Matthew, I was wondering if I could get your take on the whole concept and the whole term of an MVP.
Yeah, sure. And I think Lee and Alex have very much hit the nail on the head, and sort of they're my thoughts too. MVP is extremely misleading, and I'd go back to the point that it's really about helping people understand what the art of the possible is, and proving that their idea can progress. That doesn't necessarily have to be a product in its own right. So we've used wireframes as a way of showing them through a storyboard of how the solution could look before we even commit it to any platform. But you're absolutely right. Cloud platforms make these things really, really easy, and that in its own right can be extremely misleading. As Alex said, extremely scalable. People are led down a path where they think that once it's committed to cloud, that's it. We can take that. It's a really easy process to take that production hardened and take it out there, and it's not that straightforward. But the purpose for an MVP for me is to make sure that we take the customer's idea, we prove it, we make sure that it is viable as a product, and that's when we start to take it through to something that's a little bit more ready for action, let's say.
And Marc, as one of our panelists who's actually going out there and building these products from an end user customer point of view, what's your take?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the points that have been made so far. I guess from my perspective and TempCover's perspective, what we're looking to do is test the water as quickly as possible with whether it be new products, new features, new platforms. So designing that kind of leanest possible solution that to balance that gives us the most data possible to assess the potential success of that product is what it's all about. And it's kind of striking that balance between doing that as quickly as possible, because ultimately it's all about kind of learning as quickly as possible and frankly finding something that works or something that doesn't work, which is equally or sometimes more useful as quickly as possible. We do sometimes find stakeholders in their excitement, I'm sure we've all been guilty of this, looking to grab a couple of extra features in behind the scenes because we're so sure our new idea is going to work that we want to get a little bit more in. So I would say it's about making sure you don't include those things and you just focus on what the original target is, whether it's a feature or a product. And as I say, doing ultimately as little as possible to prove or disprove that the suggestion is going to work in the real world. And then whether that's A/B testing that in gradually or whatever it might be to kind of give you enough data to learn it whilst not maybe putting all of your customers through it at the first point.
I think that kind of raises an interesting point around the kind of velocity of minimum viable products on the cloud. Because going back to your point, Alex, what we have now is an ability to get these kind of minimum viable products out there very, very quickly without having to, for example, provision new infrastructure to run them on. They can be quickly deployed and scaled up, or even removed entirely and taken offline if needs be. Which brings me on to my next question, which is, what are the kind of core components, the main things that you need for a minimum viable product approach to work, be those technology tools or elements of an infrastructure stack, or even just approaches and attitudes? Marc, if you could kick us off for this one.
Sure. I'm not going to start with the infrastructure or the technology, actually. So carrying on from what I was just saying, I think the first thing is the focus from the stakeholders, whether they be technical or not, in many cases not, to buy into the theory of learning as quickly as possible. Once you've done that, you've identified the primary reason for the introduction of the feature or build. I think you've got half the battle won. Then we're ruthless with those requirements, obviously, to make sure nothing else creeps in that isn't going to add any value. And then from that moment onwards, then you're looking for a flexible infrastructure, obviously initiative and drive from your team to stick to the core requirement. And then, the tooling to observe and learn out the other end as well, which again, normally is kind of, it doesn't always have to be, but I suppose a lot of the tooling for that is cloud driven, whether that be Google Optimize or something like that for your A/B testing, or whether that be interrogating the data that you've collected yourself.
And Lee, as a panelist who is presumably familiar with a wide range of the aforesaid tooling and infrastructure, what's your view on the kind of key components?
Yeah, I mean, Marc touched on the organizational piece. I will touch on the technology piece in a second. just reflecting back on what you mentioned, Alex, just from all the points you mentioned there, it's interesting about MVP, where we all get a little bit about a viable product, but I think we should almost change the name to valuable rather than viable. That might really help us understand it from all sides in terms of all the engagements that you have and the stakeholders involved. But from a technology perspective, it's interesting because you've got to take the team on with you. I think we look at minimum viable or valuable products as being a dev focus, and then obviously you can move into DevOps, but you've got to have security sat around the table with you at every single step of the way. We've seen very much in the press over the past 12 months some unfortunate incidents of companies where certain cloud infrastructure has been left without the right permissions, and that's had an impact on that customer, or has an impact on that company. And that's sometimes as you move so quickly, and as you mentioned around the velocity, you can lose sight of the security aspects. You can lose sight of the other aspects around cost and optimization. I've done a recent project just a short time ago, and it's also from a technology perspective sometimes expected that you're using a minimum set of services, and I disagree with that. I was reviewing back before we had the panel today, and just recently we launched a minimum viable service for a mobile application. There was 42 different services that were being utilized, across the cloud. And that can be quite complex, everything from identity management to storage to networking to everything from monitoring to alarms for container management, Kubernetes management. So I think it's really important before you start, you get a full view of both the organizational and then the technology impacts before you venture onto something that we all think is minimum, but it's actually quite a big effort.
I think there can often be, particularly when you're when you are a developer or a development team, or the various teams within the organization that like building stuff and building new products and adding new features. I think it can be easy to get carried away with the sheer joy of creating these things without necessarily having full end-to-end oversight of where it fits within the wider organizational strategy. So, Alex, with the slightly more businessy hat on, if you like, what would you say that the foundational elements of an MVP approach are?
Yeah, so I mean, I think firstly, with any of these things, I agree. I think Marc was making the point earlier about stakeholder focus and buy-in. I think that's vital. But I think it sounds a bit trite, and it's something that, frankly, is nothing new in the environment we live in today, or even in a cloud world, or anything. It's been going around for many, many years, which is kind of starting with the end goal in mind. So really getting an understanding of where you're trying to get to. The beauty of the technology services that we have available, we use this language of fail fast. Nobody likes to fail. And there is an important point here which says that you need to understand the point at which you can actually cut this project off if you need to do so. The principle around the MVP, clearly, Lee added invaluable. I like that. I'm going to add in cloud at the end. So we're going to change the whole premise of this presentational discussion now. I describe it as a minimum viable cloud. It doesn't really matter about the point around that. I'm making a bit of a light of the whole thing, but the principle around it is that it's ensuring that you have a product in market which is designed to reduce risk and reduce cost. And ultimately, that will hopefully then demonstrate some kind of ROI before you take the next steps and invest in a bigger way. Totally agree with the point on the stakeholder buy-in, but I don't think this is any different from any project in any software world that would have been run back in the early 90s before we had the internet even. The same principles still apply. I think it's vital to gather the base of requirements and really ensure that those stakeholders are bought into it and you're representing all the areas. But again, the concept of the MVP can very quickly end up trying to boil the ocean. You're trying to do too much. And you've got to take on that vast set of requirements that may exist and maybe narrow those down to the initial stage to get this MVP out into the marketplace, be it that your internal marketplace or an external marketplace, in a mechanism that is going to work for the few, and launching it to the few, and that might be, you know, some kind of soft release that gets talked about, a beta, positioning it in that way, not positioning it as the final finished product, because ultimately it may very well fail because you won't have the buy-in that's needed at that early stage.
So speaking of that kind of early stage, I think there can often be a tendency for these projects to be extended as more stakeholders become involved and as more elements and features become added to the project for all of the reasons that we've already discussed. But one thing I wanted to touch on is the minimum part of minimum and the speed with which that can be delivered. So in terms of the speed with which you can deliver a new cloud application or a new feature set within a cloud application using a minimum viable product approach, how quickly can that go from start to finish? Marc, I know you've had some experience with this.
Sure. I mean, it's quite an open-ended question insofar as obviously we don't know what we're building. So assuming the build is the build, then again, it comes back to the identification of what we class as the kind of leanest possible solution to get that real-world answer to whether what we're planning is actually going to be successful or not. So I would say that the point made, I think, by Alex around what's changed about an MVP from decades ago to today is exactly right in principle. But I guess in practice, we've made a lot of advances with the cloud and so on to allow us to spin things up in no time at all, obviously, and that's the joy of it. So to take it to its simplest example and changing the color of a button and running an A/B test on the color of that button, I can do that as a result of the cloud services that allow me to assess it. And for something more complex, whether it be something brand new, provisioning something new is obviously instant and without the punishment of signing up for a nasty 12-month contract, which I'm probably going to size to support the thing if it's actually going to be successful, because I'm going to plan for success, because of course I am. It allows me to start off small in terms of provisioning, and you know, hopefully the success, the infrastructure will grow with it. So speed is helped a lot by the tooling that we have available to us now. And so in answer to your question, if we had an idea and it was well briefed, and if ignoring the build, we'd have something up and running today if we needed it, which is the joy of the infrastructure we have available to us nowadays, obviously.
And Matthew, how quickly do you see customers approaching these kind of projects? What kind of velocity are you seeing within the marketplace?
So generally, before Salesforce, I was at IBM, and both companies have got big sort of designs around design thinking itself. So we start from a process of understanding the user's requirements. I know that's nothing new there, but user-centered design is a way of being able to understand what the requirement is, articulate a problem statement, and use that as you, I guess, your North Star, if you will. But what we look at then is aligning that to agile design and development practices. And we're looking at trying to deliver something as an output within every 2 weeks, because it has to be iterative. And the point is, it's not necessarily an MVP at the end of 2 weeks. What it is a checkpoint with the team to have a look at what we're delivering and are we heading in the right way. Because as Alex kind of alluded to before, the thing that I see different from decades ago is we used to deliver things monolithically, right? It used to be very much a huge statement of work that we all kind of invested heavily into. It was a huge thing that we then went and tried to deliver, and at the end of it, ta-da, we've got this thing. And everyone goes, that's not what I envisaged. And then you're having to unpick all that stuff and start again. Whereas now it's because of cloud, because of design thinking, we're looking at it every 2 weeks. So it's tweaks rather than whole shift changes that enable us to do things. So I think that is what's made these things, this MVP concept, a lot more viable in many ways than it ever was.
Yeah, I
And
remember.
Lee?
Sorry, Adam, just jumping in there, if I may. The one quick thing is you remember some of this. You know, one of these cartoon anecdotes that have existed for years, where you have the thing that started with what the user wanted, which might have been a hammer, with what the developer ended up delivering, which was a hammer drill or something like that. So completely different concept, because I think, and I agree completely with Matthew's point. It's got distorted along the way. It's these sort of Chinese whispers where things have changed and developed and mutated along the way, which isn't necessarily what was wanted, what was required in the first place.
And that actually brings me on to another element that I wanted to touch on as part of this discussion, which is scope creep. We've alluded to it in various parts of this discussion already, but it's one of the problems that we frequently see cited with minimum viable product approaches, where the initial project ends up taking on too much in the early stages, but then not iterated on enough afterwards. So you end up in a kind of weird halfway house between the 2 points. And what I wanted to ask you is, how can organizations circumvent that, if you like? How can they avoid falling into that trap? Lee?
Yeah, I think what's interesting for me, it depends on who the customer is. I mean, Marc made a good point earlier. What is it that we're trying to build? And if I look at Rackspace, actually, we have many enterprise customers today where an MVP actually wouldn't be beneficial to them. They may like to do a proof of concept, but they would like a valuable or viable product service that is running and operational today. So I think sometimes you really have to understand your customer base and whether they will they will accept, at what stage will they accept a POC or minimum viable product actually moving into production. And I think back to your point, Adam, the question really comes back to the customer feedback. We can all be very iterative and do numerous releases, and to your point around scope creep, I think it's really important to make sure that actually, if you are going to build, is having, say, a customer advocacy board or an advisory board that keeps you honest. We tend to see many customers today where they build products and they'll obviously do some releases, do some A/B testing, for example, may release it to a set of their users. But actually, is there an opportunity for us to now reposition a kind of non-exec director's position, right, on many companies, where actually it's now made up of a customer advisory board, and we use that internally. So 3 times a year, we meet with many of our top customers to get feedback on our roadmap, the services, the features that we want to develop. And they really act as an advocacy group to keep us in check. If I have 13,000 services across cloud products today, Rackspace could go and support every single one of them. But it's important that you have the check and balance, and your customers will be the ones that will tell you whether it's most viable or not. Now, that's not always possible when you're going out to thousands and thousands of users, but you will be able to cluster and find different groups of users that should be able to give you that feedback. And I think that really helps with the scope creep. It stops the excitement factor kind of boiling over too much as well. So that's what we do at Rackspace, and I think that's really because of the customers that we serve. I can in Marc's space and Matthew's space and Alex's history as well, it will be very different for the different customer sets that you have.
Thanks for that. And Matthew, do you have any thoughts on the issue of scope creep and the tendency for these projects to end as something different than they initially were envisaged as?
So yeah, I think we've all been victims of scope creep at various times, right? But I think it goes back to a point that Marc made earlier. You've got to be clear on what your objective is here. What are you trying to do? And there's always going to be people who want to do more, but essentially it's keeping it locked down to that problem statement I talked about before. What are you trying to deliver? And there may be additional pieces that get added onto that. And if you want to create another sprint, another 2 weeks that enables you to prove that, then maybe that's the case. But it's all down to that's the good thing about having the 2-week sprints. You never really go massively over, because you're able to kind of rein those things in and sort of design it around that. But generally, when I've been involved in the design thinking process up front, the facilitation that we have, and I've been involved in previously, both here and in other places, has been really strong. So it's really sort of drilling down into what are you looking to deliver, and that's not necessarily a technical discussion. That's a discussion around usability. That's a discussion around what you're expecting your end user, your customer, to get from the value that they're going to derive from this actual application. So it's as long as you're delivering on those things, people tend to keep it tight, as long as you've got good facilitation around those areas.
Speaking of sprints, and particularly coding sprints and design sprints, does a minimum viable product approach necessitate the use of Agile methodologies or Devops methodologies within your organization? Is it possible to do minimum viable product effectively without having those structures in place? I think, Alex, if you could give us some insight into what SIF's members are doing in this regard.
I will endeavour. I'm not a developer myself, so you may be better off aiming somebody like Marc. I think there are certain things that certain any MVP needs to take into account, and I think about, for example, governance and compliance and regulations. And if you're a regulated industry, regulated body of any form, then whatever you're producing into market, if it's going out externally or even internally, in many cases, you have to ensure that you are adhering to certain regulations. You have a legal obligation to do that. So those things can't be ignored. I think when you get into methodologies like Agile, DevOps, DevSecOps, all of these types of things, I don't know, I sigh a little bit, because they often tend to imply large enterprise heavy lifting type of stuff that's going on, which isn't necessarily always the case. I think if there's a degree of harmony and a focus on the goals, that could be sufficient to get this thing going and off the ground. And I think that would probably be my parting shot that I would leave on that one.
And Marc, do you have any insight onto this?
Sure, yeah. So we follow a kind of Scrum framework, and for anyone who's familiar with it, I'm sure most people are, who've worked in software development, and many who haven't. It's a very lightweight framework, actually, and anyone who's adding too much to it is probably adding their own stuff to it. And it's flexible. It's not meant to be necessarily adhered to within an inch of its life, and I think that's the important part here as well. So can you develop without scope creep and so on, without something like Agile or Scrum? Well, of course you can if you've got the right people and everyone's working sensibly and helping each other. But with a lightweight framework that keeps everybody working to a kind of structured cadence, so long as it's not meaning that everyone's in meetings for half their day every single day, then I think it has an awful lot of value, and we definitely found it has.
So, are there any advantages? We've touched on quite a number already, but are there any particular advantages to an MVP-based approach that would mean companies should seek it out and should further explore it if they aren't already? Matthew, do you have any thoughts on the potential advantages of MVP-based development?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've kind of covered a bunch, as you said already there, Adam, but I think the iterative nature of it for me is really quite key, and the ability to see something quickly. So people can lose sight of what the vision is if they don't have sight of the vision, so to speak. So having quick sprints and something that's delivered really, really quickly, so you can start to see things, and as they start to take shape, so you can feel part of the process. I think that's really, really important. That's where I'd see it happening. Like back in the day, again, waterfall development, you did see business tend to drop off sometimes as business leaders lost any sight of what they were doing. It was 3-4 months before they saw anything, and you lose their backing. Whereas with something like this, you've got a very quick chance to show them something so they can get their hands on it and have a feel. They're not necessarily technical people, but they're the guys who are generally paying the bills, right? So you've got to make sure that they're the ones that are on board for the long run. And to Mark's point, this should be a diverse set of people involved in this, because there's a lot of stakeholders in it, and you need to help them come along in the same direction. And the best way to do that is with visual representation of what you're trying to deliver.
Mark, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think efficiency is getting raised, and that's the obvious answer. It's a common thing that's been mentioned throughout this chat. So learning quickly means less waste. Obviously, more efficient use of time and resource is what we're all striving for. I think one other thing to mention, depending on the type of feature/product that we're proposing here, is that potentially you start self-funding the project sooner as well. So if you are building an MVP, then actually you've got something in customers' hands sooner, which means actually there's probably cash coming in the door a bit quicker as well. And once you've got cash coming in the door, it becomes a self-funding project where the iterations actually get paid for by each previous release almost, and the enhancement in the feature. So that's a very important point.
So are there any, on the flip side, are there any traps that organizations should be aware of when it comes to approaching this kind of project? Lee, is there anything that you've seen in your various projects with customers that you would warn other organizations away from?
Yeah, it's slightly controversial, but don't hire any idiots. I think, your heroes, right? I think it's quite easy to, have the superstar developer and, have the hero that's going to fix everything and I know everything. But I think, and Matthew touched on it as well, having the right organization and the right people. I could have swore and maybe used a bit of a different word, but there's a few famous people that always say, like, it's not what you build, hire. And I think it's really important when you are looking to, you have a concept and an idea. That there's so many cloud capabilities today. Go to AWS and look at AWS's mobile pages. It'll give you every single tool that you could possibly have for a developer to fire up a quick mobile application, get an idea, and float it. It'll give you the security and the wraparound of that as well. But fundamentally, pick the right team and make sure you have a good spread of not just around the technical skills, but also the emotional intelligence as well. Because if, to Mark's point, when the money does come in, it can get quite easy to get carried away, and you've got to have people that can plan, can excite, can build, can do the plumbing. But if you do have all those heroes inside of there, your minimum viable product will stay very minimum for a long period of time.
And Matthew, are there any traps that you've seen over the course of your career when it comes to this approach?
So yeah, and I think I don't think it was that controversial, Lee. To be fair, don't hire idiots. I think that's a very, very sensible approach, to be honest. But yeah, I think it goes back to what Mark was saying earlier. We talked earlier about having frameworks in play, and are they important? The team is absolutely right. The technology here is the easy bit, if I may say that. If that's slightly controversial, it's having the process and the team in place around to enable you to go and do this stuff. You can go and get these tools anywhere, right? They're all out there. But having the right approach, the right team, divergent thinking as well. Don't think you know the answer, because sometimes we arrive at an idea and we're so stuck on it that we end up delivering the wrong thing. Whereas if you've got a lot of people, the right amount of people bringing in divergent ideas, you get to generally a much more rounded solution quicker, in my experience. So yeah, getting too focused and locked down on one particular idea can really mean that you pass up a lot of great opportunities. So just make sure you're a bit more divergent.
Alex, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go around in circles. I mean, I agree with the points certainly that are made. I think, the scope and preparation, I think, are two key elements around this, around any type of project as well. I do, despite what I said right at the start, I do agree with the principles around MVP. I think it works. I think, you know, the point on the idiots, I like the terminology. You can question. I mean, I think the essence around, I don't think anybody goes out of the way to hire poor people, do they? But I think, you know, the essence around it is if the ingredients aren't good, the meal's not going to taste very nice at the end of it, right? It's kind of what it comes back down to. But I think the elephant in the room that we haven't really touched on as we are talking about this towards the end of June is, you know, our current pandemic world here. And actually, I think in the environment that we find ourselves in as we come out of lockdown and we get some of our freedoms restored again, and people are able to return to work, be it physically or remotely, I think the dynamics are going to change. I think the focus of businesses are going to change. I think the need for MVPs are going to potentially increase. As I think that the people will be looking at a post, if we are indeed ever going to be post-pandemic world, and think what needs to be done and how their businesses now need to adapt and ensure they're mitigating for risk. So I think there is a need more than ever, arguably, as development cycles and pressures are increased, to really have this right and have utilize the concept around this, around proof of concepts, if you want to call it that, in place, so that organizations are building products that are appropriate, and indeed they can switch them off quickly if they're not working.
And finally, Marc, what would be your advice to organizations who are looking to establish themselves with an MVP?
I think, put simply, we've been talking about the temptation is to focus on the product, obviously, but don't underestimate the value of that data. You literally can never have too much of it. I think you need to give way more weighting to the measurement tooling than you'll ever think you need if you were to start out on this journey of moving towards an MVP model. Because I guarantee you won't have the answers because you won't quite know the questions that your users discover until you're there. So take the time to speak to the broader team and ask them the kind of questions they would need answering to find out if what you're planning to release is going to be successful or a failure. And to the point, but don't be scared of failure. Failure is growth, and will fuel whatever the next project is going to be. So embrace it if that's the way it's gone.
Well, there's much more we could cover in this topic. I'm sure we could spend another couple of hours happily talking about the trials and tribulations of minimum viable product development. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for as part of this session. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for taking the time to join me for this discussion, and I'd like to thank all of our viewers for tuning in as well.